Hello, everyone. This is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. We continue on our journey trying to advance the frontier of architectural thinking through interdisciplinary conversations with architects, filmmakers, and other disciplined people from around the world. Today, I am talking to Clara Kraft Isono as part of my collaborations with ADFF, the Architecture and Design Film Festival. I recently had the pleasure of introducing her film called Bawa's Garden on the life and work of the Sri Lankan architect Jeffrey Bawa. It's a fantastic film, and I had a conversation with Clara on why she made the film, what filmmaking means to her, and what an architectural film or a film about architecture should be. She's an architect herself by training, but is now practicing largely as a filmmaker. She's also faculty at the Royal College of Art in the UK, and so she has an educational background as well. So she graduated from the Architectural Association, but has also an advanced degree in filmmaking from the London Film School. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, and perhaps that will encourage you to see the film and more so make a trip to Sri Lanka. As usual, if you have comments or if you have suggestions about guests whom I could bring on my program, please send me an email at vikram.prakash@gmail.com, and I always love to hear from you. Take care. Here we go.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, Clara. Welcome to Architecture Talk. Thank you for being here. Thank you for recording this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. I've had several filmmakers on my podcast before, and of course, I've had a lot of architects, but I don't think I've ever had somebody who is both an architect and a filmmaker, and that too making films about architecture. So thank you very much for doing this. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. And for my listeners, I think I had mentioned to them once before that I was at the ADFF in here recently in Vancouver, and I had the absolute privilege of introducing one of your films called Bawa's Garden on the life and work of Jeffrey Bawa, the Sri Lankan architect. And we'll come to that, but let me just off the bat really tell you, fantastic film, just absolutely fantastic film.
Thank you.
Beautifully shot, very luscious, nice story, nice narrative, raises some good questions, and I just loved it. And I have to tell you that we had a long conversation with friends afterwards, and we all decided, well, what this means is we have to make a trip to Sri Lanka. So
Absolutely. I would encourage everyone to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you succeeded. So now something like that is going to happen. But before we come to Bawa, so you're an architect, but you're predominantly a filmmaker, or you do both? And like, how did your love for filmmaking as an architect develop? Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I wear a lot of hats. I wear all the hats, actually, filmmaker, architect. I'm also an educator, but I'll explain a little bit how I came to that. I actually began in painting, and I couldn't get into the art school that I wanted to. So fortunately, but my mother said, why don't you try architecture, because you've always drawn plans. So even as a very young child, and I didn't think I could be an architect. But anyway, I had an interview at the Architectural Association in London, and they took me on, to my surprise.
Oh.
So I fell into it. It was a kind of accident almost, let's say.
Okay.
But I absolutely loved it the minute I started doing it. It was absolutely the right choice for me. while I was a student of architecture at the Architectural Association, I was becoming very frustrated by the way that buildings were being represented in photography and in architectural films. I felt that the photographs I was seeing and the films I was seeing did not represent my experience of architecture. What I loved about it, what I thought was rich about the experience of architecture. And I didn't really know how to address that. But it was at the back of my mind for a long time. And I continued experimenting on my own, making short films and so on, and also teaching architecture students how to make films. And after about 8 years of working in practice and sort of playing around with film, I decided, okay, I want to do this seriously. And I went and did a master's in filmmaking and tried to embed myself more in the filmmaking industry, but put architecture aside. I just wanted to understand the language of film and how that is used, how you shoot, how you sound record, how you script write. And I kind of fell into fictional filmmaking, short films, nothing to do with architecture. And after I did that, I returned very slowly back to telling stories about spaces and about architecture, which is what I'd always wanted to do, to be honest with you.
Okay. So unpack this for me just before you go on a little bit. Earlier, you said there's a gap between how architecture is represented in film conventionally and how you would like it. Describe to me what you think is how architecture is generally represented in film and photography.
Well, first of all, I felt very strongly that the body was not represented. For example, often you don't see people in photographs of architecture, that they're empty images. So that's something that I felt was very odd, because we experience spaces with people and they're about people. So that was one element. But the other element that I felt was missing a little bit was this very kind of static idea that architecture is a fixed thing that never changes, and was very aestheticized and kind of severe in the way that it was being projected. And I think it's incredibly sensuous and full of life, and sometimes it's falling apart. And this kind of sensuality, I just wanted to bring it out.
So your critique is more on how architects present their work rather than how filmmakers present architecture.
Yes, I think, well, it's a combination, really. It's how architects want their work to be seen, which is quite clean and kind of objectified, let's say.
Right.
And that is how then filmmakers are briefed, or photographers are briefed.
Right.
And those are the images that are sort of given to us.
Right.
And somewhere along those lines, humanity is lost, and that's something I wanted to bring out.
Okay. All right. So you wanted to bring people the human element into an architectural narrative.
Yes. Human thought, human element, the person themselves.
Right.
The actor. Yeah.
Okay. But would you speak a little bit about the use of architecture in film in general, in sort of narrative cinema? More often than not, other than a few filmmakers, maybe Greenaway or somebody, will use it largely as stage set. Is that fair to say, like something that disappears or largely is expected to disappear with the entire focus on the actor? Is that would you say we have the reverse problem in conventional cinema?
Well, in Greenaway, if you take that as an example, I would suggest that actually the actors and the set are intrinsically connected, even in their costumes and the way they move. There's a discussion between the space and the performance, which is very, very strong. And this happens I think somebody like Almodovar, actually, he uses space very interestingly. Wenders uses space very interestingly.
Of course.
These are not architects, but they are filmmakers who identify space as being an integral element of the story, of the narrative.
Right.
For me, I think what's interesting is that I like to build my films like I would build a building. In other words, I imagine them as spaces. So I imagine, where do you enter? What does that
Mm.
feel like? What's the next
Mhm.
space that you go to? What takes you?
Mhm.
The idea of sequence and the
Mhm.
idea of time.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So when I design a building, I think about how the user walks through the building. What do they see through the window? You know, what does it feel like? I think about exactly the same things when I make a film.
Okay.
I consider those things like I would
Right.
architecture. You
Okay.
know, what opens this door and what do we see beyond this door? How do we
I
move
see.
from this space onto the next space?
And then you have your character move through that space
That's
and
right.
do that. Yeah. Okay. So
That's right. So the
that's
character
essentially.
is the vessel that takes us through the spaces, but I give the character a voice so that you feel you're traveling with her. You're
Mhm.
hearing her
Mhm.
thoughts, you're hearing what she's saying. So you're going with her through that journey. And sometimes she's moving very quickly and sometimes she's moving very slowly. That's, you know.
So was this a discourse that you took on in film school or just in your filmmaking? I mean, was this a conversation that was entertained in school by your professors, etc., or is this something completely your own?
No, actually, in film school, I didn't speak about this at all. It's interesting because in the film industry and in film school, there's very little discussion about space. It's all about
No,
time.
really?
I know, it's crazy, right? It's
What?
really funny. I know, it's incredible, but it's true. There's a lot of talk about set design, like it's a painting, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's a backdrop. Yeah.
It's a backdrop. So there's a lot of discussion about that. But actually, there is not that much discussion, spatial discussion, this discussion about light. All of these are connected, of course. But when I tried to bring up ideas like that, people looked at me very baffled. And I think it's something to do with the fact that because we experience cinema on a screen, that is a two-dimensional format, and
Mm-hmm.
because we shoot with a camera, which in theory has a frame,
Mm-hmm.
people are used to speaking in a kind of painterly fashion about shots,
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to a spatial kind of discussion.
So this is a classic disciplinary disconnect. We are constitutively interdependent, right? I mean, you really can't have film without set, site, location, really, architecture. And what would architecture be without character emplacement and people living their lives in it, and humanity and indeed all life somehow existing in it? We tend to sort of screen each other out as if they were secondary.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, another filmmaker that uses people and spaces very well is Antonioni too.
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah.
when we think about Antonioni's films, we remember the characters and how they sit in the space and how they walk through a corridor and so on.
You mentioned Greenaway, you mentioned Antonioni, and you mentioned one other filmmaker, Wim
Wim
Wenders, of
Wenders,
course.
yeah.
Of course. So these are sort of like classic great filmmakers. You said you spent some time making regular films before you turned to architectural films. What kind of films
Correct.
did you make?
I made short fiction films. One was set in India, in Ladakh, in the northern Himalayas, which was a story about two sisters who become separated. I'm very influenced by a Spanish filmmaker called Victor Erice and his film Spirit of the Beehive, which is a beautiful, beautiful film. I would recommend everyone to watch that. It's set in Spain in the 1970s. And these are films which are not about architecture in any shape or form, but they capture space so well in the intimacy between characters and places. And that's what I was trying to do in the fictions. I was trying to tell stories about people traveling through space, essentially.
Okay. But then you turned to making films explicitly on architectural topics. Why that shift?
To be honest, that's what I was always interested in, but I didn't really have an angle about how I was going to approach what I had considered a problem, let's say. And then the essay form, which is the form of this film, in other words, with a female narrative, a voiceover, where thoughts of the character are interlinked with information about the architect and so on. It's not a straightforward narrative, or it's not a straightforward catalogue film, what I would call a straightforward documentary. That offered me the opportunity to think a bit differently about how we tell stories about architecture.
I see. So documentary film, essay film, and I take it narrative cinema, conventional narrative cinema.
Yes, yes.
And this is an interesting term. To be frank, I've never heard of this term, essay film. Is this a
Yes,
common
yes.
term?
It's a very kind of established sort of alternative cinema, avant-garde cinema that started in the sort of 60s, 50s, late 50s, 60s. And Chris Marker, it's a fantastic film called Sunless, is an essay film, a very well-established essay film. But what the essay film allows you to do is to play with what is said and what you see. So as an essay, the script is telling one story, and then you see something which is related to the essay, but is not directly a reflection of what is being said. A good example of that in my film, for instance, is we're sitting somewhere, we don't know where we are, and she's having thoughts about something.
Right.
That's an essay format. Right?
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Which I think is true of how we experience architecture. We sit in spaces and we reflect on the space, but it also brings memories of other places, of maybe memories of our childhood, of other moments. So when we relate to architecture, time is very, very fluctuating because it's about the past, it's about the present, and all of those things create an image of architecture.
Okay. Just to sort of put a point on would you describe Nathaniel Kahn's film, My Architect? That's straight up documentary, you would say. That's not an essayistic film.
Yeah, that's a documentary. Yeah. It has little elements, but basically it's more of a straightforward documentary, I would say.
Right. Okay, that's amazing. It's a beautiful term, essay. I mean, I generally associate it with, the French sense of the word, to try something, which is improvisational and propositional rather than documentary. I suppose that fits the same concept, that it has a proposition which is put in place, which is different from documentary, which is stated as being factual, I suppose.
Correct. What the essay demands is the spectator or the reader to write their own story through what they're reading. So they put on their own interpretation. That's the beauty of it.
I see.
That it's not dogmatic in telling you this is this and that is that, but it's asking you to think about things in a much more kind of ambiguous manner.
Interesting. That's great. I've never heard of this term. Okay, so what I'm picking up a little bit over here is you have some kind of interest in South Asia or India. Even when you were making your first film, you were up in Ladakh. Yeah. What's going on? What's your connection with South Asia?
Honestly, I don't know. I've always been really drawn to India and South Asia. I mean, it's not. I just think they're incredible places. I think there's incredible architecture, incredible people working there. And to me, it offered an alternative to the world that I was in. There was something that I attuned to, that I felt close to, even though it's not my culture. It gave me the opportunity to look at the world in a different way, which was incredibly enriching.
That's it, but you have no connection. You're not.
Maybe in a previous life, who knows?
In a previous life. There you are, you're South Asian and you're thinking already. or the next. You can also always count on the next.
Exactly. I'm working towards that.
All right. Okay. All right, so just something in South Asia, but somewhere around the way, I suppose you ran into the work. So let's turn to the Bawa film, Bawa's Garden. Well, what drew you to Geoffrey Bawa and this topic?
Well, it's literally like what the film describes. I was a student of architecture, bored with my project, sitting in a library. This is before the internet, right? So the only source we had of the world were libraries. We would sit in libraries and look at books, and the best thing was like when you.
I don't think my students know what that is anymore. I mean, it's such a loss, I tell you.
I mean, it's not that different on the internet, I guess. But
I guess.
I guess, but I just literally stumbled across this book, which is always the best discovery, right? So I found this book, which was about Lunuganga, the garden that Geoffrey Bawa had designed. It's a kind of huge black and white photography book with incredible photographs taken by Dominic Sansoni, the Sri Lankan photographer. And I just opened the book and I looked at these images and I had never seen anything like it. I thought, what is this place? Why has nobody ever told me about this place? Like, why don't we learn about places like this in architecture school? And so I became completely fascinated by it. And at some point, the book got lost and I never found it again. And it was out of print and I couldn't get a copy in London. And, it's not like I could go on to the web and look for it. So it kind of grew in my mind. It kind of became a kind of mythical place. And then obviously years later, I did find a book. And then even years later, I then went there. And I just thought there was something about Lunuganga that spoke to me about a world, there's a different world that was worth exploring and understanding why did it exist? How did it come about? What is it? Who did it? Who was there?
So very different from the education you were getting at the AA, I take it.
Correct. Except, interestingly enough, Geoffrey Bawa studied at the AA. So in the late 90s, when I was a student, there was a kind of a revival of his work.
No, really?
Yes, and there was a tiny exhibition in London. So
Mohsen was there still? Who was the dean? Who was the Mohsen or
Moisen was
the
dean. But actually, the exhibition was before Moisen, I think, if I remember. I get my dates mixed up. But But the point is that there was a little revival about Geoffrey Bawa was still alive at the time, and so there was a bit of interest. But still, it was very, not so much was known about him. And then he disappeared off the radar. His work kind of disappeared a little bit for about 10 years. You didn't hear much about him.
How was he presented, if you remember, in that exhibition? Was he sort of exoticized? How was the presentation, good or not?
I think it was okay, but there were some very, very beautiful drawings. He was very interested in the way his work was drawn.
Yeah.
And there were some intriguing photographs, but it was still quite difficult to understand, I felt.
Okay, but it still felt, what I know of the AA and its education and its sort of ethos, although I suppose the idea of tropical architecture, Jane Drew was teaching there in the 60s and 70s.
Yes.
But a long way from what was going on in the school in the 80s and I suppose 90s. But it felt very different, or did you talk to other students about it? Were others interested in things like this or not?
There was some interest. There wouldn't have been an exhibition otherwise. So there was definitely some interest. But, I think what's really interesting is that Geoffrey Bawa didn't really like his time at the AA. He kind of just hung out and didn't do much studying, to be perfectly honest with you.
Right.
He spent most of his time in
Italy.
Italy.
Plesner writes very poorly of him. But anyway, we'll come to that later.
And the School of Tropical Architecture was already there when Geoffrey was studying at the AA, but he didn't partake in any of, didn't have much connection to it because he didn't really believe in what they were teaching. So he was always an oddball while he was at the AA, and he was an oddball also in Sri Lanka for a long time because people didn't really...
He was an oddball from whatever register you look at him at, right? Because he doesn't fit any of the molds. He's not your classic celebrated South Asianist either. Because he was this upper class kind of haughty man and very colonial, but at the same time, he doesn't fit the colonial mindset. And he certainly didn't fit the modernist worldview, I don't think they liked him because he did cool white buildings. But at the same time, he wasn't really a vernacularist either. Oddball for show from every direction.
Yeah, when he was at the AA, it was very modernist. And he initially tried to integrate some of those ideas in Sri Lanka when he first arrived. But he quickly realized that that wasn't going to work. So he actually took his guidance from someone called Minette de Silva.
Minette,
Yeah. So he was very inspired by her, and he recognized that she was onto something. And he thought, okay, maybe I should do something a bit more like that, which is more regional, essentially.
Wow, I've never heard that. That's interesting. So he was inspired
Yes.
by Minette? That's not in your film. I don't remember that.
No, I had a whole section about Minette de Silva. We worked with an actress and we did a whole bunch of scenes, but then it didn't really fit with the film, so I had to cut it out. But she was really key to his education and to the development of his work, which is a shame.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely. I know this because I spent a long time speaking to the biographer, the official biographer of Geoffrey Bawa, David Robson, which, by the way, has a fantastic book about his work. And he knew Geoffrey and he worked with Geoffrey, and he also knew Minette. And he said that he absolutely admired her. He didn't like her very much, but he really admired her work.
That's an interesting thing, because Minette's always talked about in Corbusier circles and so on. So did Bawa work with Minette or fought Minette or what?
No, he didn't. I don't know if you know the story, but Ulrich Plesner originally went to work with Minette, not with Geoffrey Bawa.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Geoffrey was a big admirer of Minette's, and he went to visit Minette up in Kandy. Kandy is a different town to Colombo. She was based in Kandy. He went to visit her, and that's where he met Ulrich and convinced Ulrich to leave Minette's office and come to Colombo. So that's how Minette and Bawa's friendship basically collapsed.
Ended.
But she already in the 50s had written something about critical regionalism before that was even a word. And she was very interested in how to develop a critical language within a modern Sri Lanka, which is essentially what then Bawa went on to do,
Okay, so before we get on to Bawa, why didn't you make the film on Minette?
Well, I only found out about all of that after I was already making the film about Bawa, basically.
Right.
I didn't know about her before. It was through speaking to people, and unfortunately, there's not much of Minette's work left. So
I know.
It's very difficult to make a film about her.
Everyone says the only thing that's surviving is the book. She self-published. But there's so much interest in her work now. We need to find a magic treasure trove somewhere. Somebody will. Probably Sri Lanka. But let's return back to, I want my narrative with you to stay on you and your journey with Bawa and your making of the film. So you saw this book, then there's this exhibition, and then you refound the book. So, but still, it's a huge investment to decide to make a whole film. How did you come to make the decision to make a whole film on him?
I wanted my first feature film to be about architecture, and I was pursuing a number of avenues. I also have made a different film about Utzon, John Utzon, about his house in Mallorca. Yeah. But ultimately, I managed to contact the Geoffrey Bawa Foundation, and they supported me in making this film.
Okay.
And
they financed the whole thing?
No, they didn't finance the film. They supported me in kind, but also in creating this, in meeting all this incredible network of people, all the people that I interview in the film.
Okay. If I may ask, how was it funded? How was the film funded?
Well, a lot of it was funded in kind. So a lot of the equipment was funded in kind. A lot of the people who were filming were my friends, who I have a lot of favors to, we help each other.
Wow.
And then we had some money that I had raised to fly everybody out there. But when we got there, we realized we didn't have enough money we had a 2-week shoot, and we didn't know how we were going to sleep everybody. And the great thing about Geoffrey Bawa is that he built amazing hotels. And the good thing is that all his clients are incredibly happy with their hotels. So they basically funded our accommodation for 2 weeks.
Wow.
So it was
Fantastic.
all rolling and happening as we were going. And then for the post-production, we got some funding here in the UK.
So you were well received in Sri Lanka, it seems like.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, incredible. Everyone who I met is so supportive and so interested to talk about his work. And yeah, it's great. It was very well
That's
received.
wonderful. So you decided to cast a friend or an actress as, I suppose, you, or how
Yes.
did you come up with this character? And tell us a little bit about the sort of structure of the film, and then how you decided to cast this central character.
So the film is a road movie which follows an architect as she's trying to find Lunuganga, which is Geoffrey Bawa's garden. And she travels around the island visiting various projects of Geoffrey Bawa, meeting his collaborators, eventually ending up in Lunuganga. And the actor who is playing the architect is actually an architect. They're not an actor.
Okay.
And she's a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And her presence in the film is, she's quite soft-spoken. She moves quite slowly. There's a kind of calmness to the way that she engages with the spaces and with the interviews, which I liked, which I wanted in order to allow the audience to really fall into the spaces and into this kind of lusciousness of Sri Lanka. She is essentially playing out a journey that I did. So all the interviews you see in the film or the places that we went is a journey that I had previously made in order to make the film.
I see.
The kind of research.
So you wrote a narrative based on your own previous journey.
Correct.
You didn't make her up, yeah.
No. So I did the journey first myself, and then I wrote a script that basically followed that journey.
So she's an architect and never acted before in film?
Correct. She'd never acted in films before.
Well, congratulate her on my behalf.
I will. She did an amazing job.
You did do it. Very convincing, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how you wrote the narrative and that's how you structured it. What were you trying to say? It's a road movie and much is up to the reader, I take it. But what is it about Bawa's architecture or Bawa that you were trying to say?
Well, I was trying to say a lot of things, but I'm going to maybe first talk about what I was trying to say about Bawa. So Bawa is a very controversial figure because, he's kind of from the upper class. He looks European. He's kind of from a colonial background. He's making work in very challenging conditions, but he's obviously very well off. In that sense, he's quite a difficult person to like, let's say. But I could see in the project,
which by the way, I want to compliment you from, because I'm sick and tired of, even when Doshi was given the Pritzker, all they cited was his supposed low-cost housing, which is very little part of his work. It just drives me nuts that if you're talking about South Asia, you can't talk just about beautiful architecture. So go on.
Yeah. So I quite like these figures that are a little bit difficult, let's say. I don't like the kind of easy story.
Yeah.
But I wanted to delve deeper because I felt the architecture was extraordinary. And what I found out, of course, is that he built over 150 buildings, all different types of programs, from government buildings to hotels to housing to charity work, to churches, a huge array of work. We basically know him from his hotels. And also he worked with clients who had an enormous amount of money, but he also worked with clients who had no money. And he took up those challenges to try and work with as little money as possible, but incredibly challenging conditions to build something very rich. And then there is another aspect of Geoffrey Bawa, which I think is interesting, which is that he was queer. Now, I don't discuss that in the film because I didn't want that to determine the film or determine his persona. And also, he was queer at a time and in a situation which is very different to, say, a queer person now in Sri Lanka, insofar that he was very he was from the upper class, so he could be whatever he wanted to be in many ways, right?
Right.
And that is quite a difficult thing to kind of communicate. But at the same time, it did define him as a kind of outsider in that society, because he could never really be himself. So I felt that that was quite interesting, that he was an outsider within the architectural community. He was an outsider as a Sri Lankan because of his status, and he was an outsider because of his sexuality. So all of these things, I think, contributed to a kind of architecture and a kind of way of looking at the world that was different. And that's what was interesting. That's interesting to me, that he didn't try to fit in any way.
No, he always
which is a very, very difficult thing to do. It was partly, as I say in the film, it's partly because he had money, he didn't have to fit sometimes. But still, you have to have a really strong character and confidence in your own work and in what you believe to be able to push, your architecture to become so unique, in its language and approach, and then to be recognized and so universal as well. So I admire that. I admire that in his work. And I would say that that's very similar, for instance, to Lina Babadi, who is another one of my heroes, the Brazilian architect.
Yes, of course. Where do you think his confidence came from? From the wealth and class?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, it came from that. But it also came from the fact that he was a bit older when he had studied architecture. So he graduated when he was 38. So at that point, he knew what he wanted and he didn't mess about. And I think he was talented. He just had a very interesting vision. And he had good luck, as much as I don't like Ulrich Plesner, I think Ulrich Plesner was very pivotal to, at a certain point in his development, to really creating great pieces of architecture. So he was lucky, he was wealthy, and he was lucky in some moments in his life, and determined, extremely determined.
Yeah. Why didn't you introduce the fact that he was queer in the film?
I felt that it would sort of color everything else. In a sense, it's become like the center of many discussions at the moment about our identity, about who we are, about how we see the world. Of course, it's incredibly important. I understand that. But what I was trying to talk about him being an outsider, which also, the queerness is part of that, was just as important.
That's an interesting position to take, in that what I'm hearing you say is that obviously his outsiderness in multiple registers was important, but you didn't want the idea of queerness to overshadow that.
I think it's important, don't get me wrong, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable about outing someone who didn't out themselves.
Interesting. I see. Yeah, he didn't out himself, but at this point he is well outed, is he not?
In some circles, yes. Well, he's definitely outed now, that's for sure. I think it's interesting insofar in how it might have affected his work or the way he thought about space. In other ways, I don't think it's that relevant, I suppose.
Okay, well, talk to me a little bit about your cinematic strategy, your camera work. Well, let me throw something at you. Inversely, I would have described your camera work, this is just provocation, as a bit painterly. It stays very still, like Greenaway in some senses. Talk to me a little bit about your camera.
Yeah, no, I would say that's probably true. I think there are times where I feel that the frame should be like a room. So I want you to sit in that room and just take it in. So I don't want the camera to move. The moment the camera moves, you become conscious of the camera. I just want you to feel as if you're inside that space, which is why I keep it quite still. So things like sound, are very important in those moments to give a sense of atmosphere.
Mhm.
At other times, the camera moves quite a lot, kind of when they're moving through the spaces, and it's kind of quite flowing.
Mhm.
And those are different moments where I almost want you to be bodiless, if you like. It's more like you're floating through the space in the way that the camera is very slowly following the figure as we go from
Mhm.
one space to the other. But yeah, as I said, sometimes the idea of the camera is to take you from one location to the other. So the camera or what is on the frame is moving very quickly, like say, like the train scenes or the car scenes or so on. So you build up the sequence. So you're sometimes moving quite fast, and sometimes you stop. You arrive somewhere and you just want
Mhm.
to see, you want to take in the space.
Right.
And then you keep on moving. So
Mhm.
in that sense, it's like rooms in a building, as I was describing before. You enter
Mhm.
one space, you look out the view, you take in the atmosphere, then
Mhm.
you move, you go into the next space, you take, and of course, in those spaces, you're having the different interviews as well,
Mhm.
right? So you
Mhm.
meet one person, you sit with them, you talk about something, then there's movement, you go into the next room.
Mhm.
Perhaps that's not so much about the camera, and that's more about to do with the editing, but those things are always connected, like how you
Right.
shoot and how you edit.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we spend a lot of time getting to the estate, so it's a road movie in that sense. By the way, I think you're probably from audience reaction, your most memorable scene is when your character is asking for directions, and the three guys point in three different directions. Even as a South Asianist, I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah.
Those are things that happen to me. I mean, to be fair, that's something we reenacted.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Got it. Yeah, yeah.
But it actually, that's what happened to me,
Yeah, well, those guys did a good job too. It didn't look like they were. Yeah, it was all very persuasively done.
Quite surprised to learn that that wasn't you.
Right. What would you say is your favorite scene?
Well, I think two of them. One, I really like the scene where you had the camera positioned orthogonally to the character who has her own camera focused on a architect that she's interviewing. And I thought that was beautiful. And it really captured a lot of the ethos that I think you're trying to show, which is like producing architecture, but also producing a narrative within it, but also producing the sense of the making of a documentary. So I think it captured like 4 or 5 things with grace and elegance, without too much, fancy camera work, but well-positioned camera. I like that one very much. And I also liked the interview with the person who did that balustrade.
Oh, Lucky Senanaika. Yeah,
Who
the
passed
artist.
away. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that wasn't scripted. I mean,
No.
yeah, I mean, that felt very real.
Yeah.
And I thought just that setting was incredible. And what I loved about that was that you got a sense of what it feels to be in Sri Lanka, and that idea that to make a garden, growing a garden in Sri Lanka is about trimming, not growing. You understood that, and you get a sense of what it means to be in the tropics and how to sit and be there. I thought those two scenes were most memorable for me.
Thank you. That's
Yeah,
great to hear.
Yeah, those were fantastic. I really enjoyed them. But what I wanted to say was, a long time getting to Lunaganga, but you don't get into the estate that much. You don't show it in great detail.
No.
Why not? Why not?
I wanted to keep it quite mythical in a sense. And to be honest, the title Bawa's Garden, what I was trying to say is that everything that he did is a garden. So Bawa's Garden is all his work. All his work is like, if Sri Lanka is the garden, his work is dispersed in that garden, because he thought of buildings like gardens. It's what Angela Andram says about how he designed a building like he would design a garden. He's just using building material. So Bawa's garden talks about, what about if we think about architecture like a garden, and we imagine it as growing, as decaying, as being wet, as being open to the elements, and all of these things, that those are an integral part of architecture. And things like that are obviously not easier, but lend themselves perhaps more quick, they lend themselves in a tropical kind of climate, because you're able to have a lot of openings and being inside and outside. But still, tropical climate is very challenging. There's a lot of rain, there's a lot of heat. So it's very easy to just glorify it. It's actually a very challenging condition, and the buildings deal with a lot of moisture, and there's a lot of issues which he had to think about over time, and he dealt with very, very well.
There's this fantastic sense in the end, jungle or the forest taking over the big hotel, and the animals moving in, and the monkeys in the lobbies and the corridors and so on and so forth. This idea that shelter is at best a transitory respite from the elements, but it's really the elements that rule, is a powerful idea, I think. It's the opposite of thinking of architecture as permanence, as the Egyptian pyramids still here 3,000 years from now, although they serve no purpose, is I think a very strong concept. In fact, have you heard of Kishkindha?
Of who, sorry?
Kishkindha, I'll tell you, you know the Ramayana, the Hindu epic?
Yes, I do.
I was on a studio review, and there's a translator of it, and she was talking about the cities in the Ramayana. And, there is the classic city of God, Ayodhya, of course, reproduced everywhere. And then there is the opulent city, which is Lanka, which is the Ravan city. But there's a third city, and that's the Kishkindha, which is the forest city, which the hero prince stays at in part of his exile. And this translator was telling me that it's not a city in the forest, it's the forest as a city. And I thought that was a powerful idea. And I have this conceptual practice called the Office of Uncertainty Research. And we did a project in which we said, if we transformed our cities back into forests, but inhabited forests, where we lived with all the other animals and all other life forms, what it would be. We are exhibiting this in Venice, incidentally, this April to November. And this is a concept that I personally felt a lot of resonance with in Bawa's architecture as you presented it.
Yes, it sounds like a fascinating concept. I mean, one of the things that I always found in his work is that he spoke about climate. Now we are talking about climate change and the repercussions of that, and how we have to be kind of climate intelligent. But he always spoke about climate in relation to culture, and that these things were completely intrinsic. So he understood that in order to work with the climate, that the climate has to become part of our culture and of the culture of the building in order for it to work. So these are things that we're starting, which is, to me, is kind of a reflection of when you were saying, instead of thinking of a city and a forest, let's think of the forest as a city, right? One of the things new projects that I'm doing, I'm trying to raise some money for next year this year is 75 years of Luna Ganga. And the Jeffrey Bawa Foundation is putting together a fantastic program, which is called To Luna Ganga. For that, I have been in discussions with them about, how do you archive a garden, right? How do you archive something that is living?
Right.
So we're trying to get some money together to do a 3D scan of the entire garden and make an animation of this garden kind of a virtual reality animation, which is from a 3D scan that would
What?
look.
How do you do a 3D scan of a garden? I don't get it.
Well, it's a lot of data collection. Basically, you need a LiDAR scan, which is a 3D scanner, and they do these really high quality scans up to the tiniest leaves.
Okay.
And that is a 3-dimensional scan of the space, and from that you build a digital model, which you then can walk
and then
through. And so on. That's
you
right.
use an
But
Oculus
of course,
and do that. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the idea is, how do you bring elements of time into something that you're scanning in a split second? So through animation, how can you talk about the past, but also about the future?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds counterintuitive to the ethos of the work, does it not? That, the garden is supposed to keep growing. And so is Lulanganga just preserved, or do they let the garden grow? What's happening?
Well, it's very interesting, because when I was filming around the garden, I came across the main gardener. He was looking at his mobile phone, and he had a black and white photograph on his mobile phone. And I recognized the black and white photograph because it was from the same book that I'd first seen. And I said I said to him, "What are you doing with this photograph? This is extraordinary." And he said, "Well, we use these photographs to cut back the garden, because these are the earliest photographs of the garden."
Yeah.
So they try to keep certain views exactly how they were, but it's impossible. I mean, this is a body that is growing. So it's a constant kind of revaluing of what you cut, what you grow. It's a constant curation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And things die too, right? Like there might be trees that will die, or storms, and so things are changing. It's not something that you can retain exactly as it is.
Yeah, I'm very critical of our campus over here, because our campus is designed by the Olmsted brothers. And, they keep it exactly. And I'm like, is that what landscape architecture is? But, administration has to preserve its picture, because that's what they've put in the brochures, and, so on and so forth. So yeah, let's, as we round up over here, let's debate this a little bit. So what is your preservation philosophy with respect to?
Well, my point is that it's not only about gardens, it's also about buildings.
Sure.
You have to allow buildings also to develop, to change, to fall apart, to rebuild, to grow certain parts, and to cut other parts away.
Exactly.
In the film, one of the first buildings we go and see is a government building that has fallen into disrepair, because it no longer functions in the way that it should have functioned in the 60s when it was first built. But that's a lack of vision by the government or the client for not rethinking how does a building develop. And I think that's something, for example, in the Candelama Hotel, another project where Jeffrey Bawa designed it to be finished in the early 2000s, but his vision was for 25 years later. So he imagined the building as it would be over many, many years. He didn't imagine it on day one. He imagined it in year 30 or 40 or 50. He constantly saw it as a body that was in constant change. And I think that's how we should think about not only gardens, but also buildings.
But here you're helping put together 75 years of Lunaganga. It's 3 times the Bawa length, which suggests that there should have been 3 iterations. If 25 is a number for something to grow into, by philosophy, the garden should look very different today, should it not?
I think it probably does. It probably looks incredibly different, and yet it's a tricky one, really, because the place can change, but the vision can be continuous. So you can have a vision for a place, an idea about, let's say the vision is openness or continuity, or you can have a vision for a place, but and the vision can be always the same, but you have to allow it to change with the place itself. When I look at the photographs of the book Lunaganga, which was shot in the 70s, I believe, some spaces look very similar and other places look completely different. And maybe that is an element of how fast some things grow and others don't, but it might be also an element of curation.
Yes. It's a tough one. I mean, I grew up in Chandigarh, in North India, Kabuzier's big city, and the entire conversation there is about preservation and keeping things exactly as. And I'm like, we have to think about preservation differently as a living thing. But then that question becomes so much more complicated when you're talking about gardens and when we're talking about a garden philosophy of Geoffrey Bawa's. We're not talking about Versailles or Stowe or whatever, where there's a fixed picture and, it's about that one vision, right? Here it's Bawa's conception, particularly as you narrated, which was very persuasive for me, was about a living entity. And I got a sense there was a strong Bawa just worked with an intuition about what he wanted it to be, rather than a kind of a picturesque premeditation, right?
I agree. Yeah. It changed with him. So, for example, he would travel to China and then he would see something. And then from those travels, he would bring something. Then he would travel to somewhere in Sri Lanka and he would see something and that would influence it. So the garden was changing as he was changing, as he was seeing things.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Okay, to the end then, what are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, as I was explaining, I'm interested in delving in virtual reality. My background is in film, but virtual reality brings architecture and film together. That's the way I see it. So it has narrative elements and has also spatial elements. So that's one little project that I'm looking at for this Lunaganga program. And then I'm looking at possibly making a film about Lina Bobardi, the Brazilian architect, who is of a similar time. Very interesting again, an outsider insofar that she was an Italian woman in a Brazilian country, in Brazil.
Right.
She was left-wing at a time when there was a dictatorship. So, all kinds of analogies with Geoffrey's story, I suppose, and possibly maybe about Zaha Hadid. I'm interested in making a film about a woman architect next, basically.
Got it. Something about misfits that really attracts you.
Correct. Misfits. Zaha is another misfit. I mean, she's a big misfit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. What is it about them that you find interesting?
I just think they're interesting because they have a different view on what architecture should be. And they talk about things that other people don't talk about. And they have the guts to just push their ideas, whether you like them or not. And I think that always tells us something about the world that is worth discovering.
Well, it's such a pleasure to discover the world of architecture with you, Clara. Thank you for making the film. Thank you for all the films you make, and I look forward to your future project.
Thank you, Vikram. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.